She walked in slowly, as if she already knew she wouldn't be welcome, wearing a floral dress, an old coat, and a gaze heavy with decades. No one asked her name. No one cared why she was there, but she moved through the shelves as if searching for more than a book, as if each step carried a piece of an old promise, and when she finally reached out her hand, something about the gesture made time pause. But no one was prepared for what would come next. It lasted only seconds, just long enough for silent judgments to ripple through the room. An employee approached her with coldness, as if she were a mistake inside the store. Customers averted their eyes, as if she had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for her. But she didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held the book gently and as if it were sacred, and was cast out beneath invisible applause of quiet disdain. 1 week later, she returned. The same woman, the same coat, the same silence. But this time there was something in her hands, something she had been holding for 40 years, something that could turn a key or reopen a wound. She didn't ask for an apology. She didn't demand anything. She simply asked to show them something. Inside the book there was a mark, a folded page, a fading handwritten note, and one sentence that made everyone in the room hold their breath. The truth had been hidden there all along. No one had ever bothered to see it. This story isn't about revenge, it's about promise, about silence and faith, about what happens when a woman decides to return to the place where she was wounded. Not to retaliate, but to reveal. Because sometimes what the world ignores is exactly what it most needs to hear. And an old dedication can say everything a lifetime tried to keep hidden. You're about to discover why. Before diving into this exciting story, we want to make sure you don't miss out on any of our incredible content. If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, now is the perfect time to do so. By subscribing, you'll become a valued member of our growing community, where we share amazing stories, insightful lessons, and much more. Don't wait any longer. Hit that subscribe button now and join us on this amazing journey. The faint light of an autumn morning filtered through the faded curtains of the small Harlem apartment. Eleanor held an old photograph between her knotted fingers, her gaze lost in the memories the image stirred. It wasn't just a picture. It was a portal to a time she had tried to bury for 4 decades. The photo showed 2 identical young women smiling, arms wrapped around each other beneath the Manhattan sky, a sky that had once seemed wider, full of promises in that distant era. "Grandma, are you sure you don't want me to come with you?" Kayla's voice broke the silence, pulling Eleanor back to the present. The 15-year-old girl watched her grandmother with that unique mix of concern and admiration only grandchildren can express. Her coiled hair framed a young face that carried unmistakable traces of the older woman. Eleanor adjusted her vintage eyeglasses and carefully placed the photograph inside her worn-out purse. Her movements were deliberate, as if each one carried the weight of a long-postponed decision. "No, sweetheart," she finally answered, her voice low but steady, like a calm, deep river. "Some things need to be done alone. Some journeys can't be shared until they've reached the end." The apartment was quiet, save for the steady ticking of the wall clock, a silent witness to decades of tears and quiet smiles within those walls. Eleanor rose with that signature dignity that neither age nor hardship had ever managed to bend. Her pastel floral dress stood in soft contrast to her dark skin, and the modest crucifix hanging from her neck caught the light briefly as she turned to grab her wool coat. "Are you going to get what you told me about?" Kayla asked, biting her lower lip, too curious to keep still. Her eyes followed her grandmother's every move, trying to unravel the mystery that hung in the air of that not-so-ordinary morning. Eleanor smiled, not with her lips, but with her eyes, the kind of smile that holds untold stories. "I'm going to get something that belongs to both of us," she said at last, gently brushing her hand across her granddaughter's cheek. "Something that was taken from me a long time ago, and might just be the most precious thing I can leave you." The sounds of the city briefly spilled into the apartment as Eleanor opened the door. New York never slept, never fell completely. Silent, always impatient to tell a new story. She adjusted the coat over her aging shoulders and made sure she had her small weathered Bible, a companion through so many moments of doubt and comfort. "Don't wait for me for lunch," Eleanor called out from the hallway. "And don't worry if I take a while. Some reconciliations take time." She closed the door before Kayla could ask anything else, leaving behind a silence thick with anticipation. At the subway station, Eleanor took a deep breath as she waited for the train that would take her to the Upper East Side. Her fingers unconsciously touched the slip of paper where she had written the address, even though she knew it by heart. The Golden Page was more than just a bookstore. It was the setting for a reckoning that had been postponed for decades. The subway arrived with a screech, its doors opening wide as if inviting Eleanor to finally face her past. When she stepped into the half-empty car, Eleanor clutched her purse to her chest, feeling through the fabric the outline of the old photo and the yellowed card with the bookstore's address. The train lurched forward, pulling her away from the comfort of her Harlem home. Through the window, she watched the city gradually change, the scenery shifting like pages in a book she was now determined to finish writing. The golden clock on the wall of the Golden Page bookstore struck exactly 11 o'clock as Eleanor stepped through the heavy glass and oak doors. The intense scent of old paper and leather wrapped around her like a forgotten embrace, making her close her eyes for a brief moment. That smell, how many memories it carried. It was that same fragrance she had once dreamed of during sleepless nights, decades ago, when her words came alive in the solitude of her small bedroom. When she opened her eyes again, Eleanor immediately noticed the gazes shifting in her direction. They were not welcoming. An elegant woman in pearls discreetly pulled her designer handbag closer upon seeing her approach. A man in a suit adjusted his glasses, examining her with a cautious curiosity Eleanor knew all too well. The silent message was clear. "You don't belong here." Eleanor straightened her posture, wearing the dignity she had cultivated as armor all her life. Her steps were slow but steady on the wooden floor, which creaked gently beneath her feet. Towering shelves rose to the ceiling, arranged like silent guardians of literary treasures. Few were allowed to touch. The contrast between her simple floral dress and the store's opulence couldn't have been more stark. "Can I help you?" The sharp voice came from a tall young employee in a bow tie and crisply pressed shirt. Joshua Parker looked at her, with that customer service smile that never quite reached the eyes, a smile that silently asked, "What could someone like you possibly want here?" His hands were clasped in front of him, a posture that blended superiority with surveillance. "I'm just browsing, thank you," Eleanor replied calmly, avoiding confrontation. Her eyes were already scanning the shelves methodically, seeking the section she had memorized through careful research at the public library. "American contemporary fiction from the 80s, she murmured to herself, ignoring how Joshua continued to watch her, trailing behind as though she might slip something valuable into her bag at any moment. A well-dressed couple passed Eleanor, whispering something that made the woman chuckle behind a gloved hand. Eleanor pretended not to notice, focusing instead on the neat rows of book spines. Her fingers trembled slightly when she finally found the section she was looking for, a small area dedicated to rare first editions of contemporary American authors. Behind the sleek marble counter, a young saleswoman watched Eleanor with a puzzled expression, whispering something to Joshua, who now pretended to rearrange books far too close, an obvious attempt to monitor the unexpected customer. The expensive watches on the customer's wrists seemed to mark a different kind of time, faster, more impatient than the slow, deliberate pace Eleanor inhabited. Looking for a specific title, Joshua pressed again, stepping closer, his expensive cologne invading Eleanor's space. There was a faintly condescending tone in his voice, as though he doubted she truly understood the value of what she was touching. Eleanor noticed how he subtly positioned himself between her and the most valuable shelf. Eleanor didn't respond right away. Her eyes had found something. A dark green spine with gold lettering, now partly faded by time. Her heart skipped involuntarily. She reached out slowly, hesitating as if touching a ghost. Her fingers paused an inch from the book as a surge of memories overwhelmed her. The clack of a typewriter in the dead of night, twin laughter shared over cheap coffee, promises whispered beneath a starry Harlem sky. "Did you find something interesting?" Joshua's voice rang out again, this time closer, sharper, as if her presence near the store's most prized books genuinely unnerved him. Eleanor could feel the weight of his gaze on her shoulders, a weight that carried not just suspicion, but an entire system of judgment that had followed her for a lifetime. The touch of Eleanor's wrinkled fingers on the book's spine sent a shiver through her body like an electric current. At last, after so many years. Whispers at Dusk by E.J. Williams, a pseudonym that, for decades, no one had ever connected to her real name. A rare book, now regarded as a hidden masterpiece of American literature, prized by collectors, not for what they knew about its author, but for the mystery surrounding her. "Ma'am, that volume is not for sale." Joshua's voice rang louder now, drawing curious glances from other customers, who began to watch the scene like eager spectators. "It's a highly valuable first edition, display only." His tone made it clear what he thought. Someone like her could never afford such a literary treasure. Eleanor ignored the remark, feeling the weight of the book in her hands as she carefully pulled it from the shelf. A physically light object but heavy with emotional weight. Her fingertips traced the faded gold embossing of the title, feeling each letter like one might caress the face of a long-lost loved one. "I know exactly what this is," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put that book back." Joshua stepped closer, his face now twisted in a mix of irritation and genuine alarm. His defensive posture, tense shoulders, clenched jaw. Eleanor recognized the signs. The same look she had faced decades ago when she tried to publish under her own name. The same condescending tone from editors who had suggested a neutral pen name, one that would hide both her race and her gender. A small circle of onlookers began to form around them. Whispered voices speculated. Judgmental eyes scanned her from head to toe, noting the simple floral dress, the worn shoes, the coat that clearly didn't come from any Upper East Side boutique. Eleanor felt the familiar sting of those stares, like needles in her skin, but she held on to the composure she had perfected over a lifetime of moments just like this. "I'm just checking something," Eleanor said, gently opening the book to its first pages. Her heart beat unevenly as she searched for the reason she had come, the handwritten dedication, those secret words only she would recognize. But before she could reach the page, she felt a firm hand close around her wrist. "That's enough." Joshua's voice cut like a razor. "I'm going to need you to hand me the book right now." The abrupt grip on her arm drew even more attention. Now the entire store seemed to have stopped to witness the standoff. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, I'll have to call security." Eleanor looked directly into Joshua's blue eyes and saw it all. Fear disguised as authority, prejudice dressed as procedure, ignorance masked by protocol. "Please, I just need to check one thing," she insisted, her calm voice a stark contrast to the rising hostility around her. "I have no intention of damaging anything." "What could you possibly need to check?" Joshua's voice grew, louder, laced with indignant disbelief. "This copy is worth over $3,000. It's an authentic first edition, not some flyer for you to thumb through." His grip on Eleanor's wrist tightened slightly, making the gesture even more humiliating in the eyes of the growing crowd. A woman in a fur coat whispered something to her companion, both shaking their heads disapprovingly. A middle-aged man cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. The bookstore, once a sanctuary of hushed reverence, now buzzed with tension, the air charged with the energy of expectation. Everyone was waiting for the outcome of this unlikely confrontation. "Are you trying to steal?" The accusation came suddenly, harshly, ratcheting the tension to a new level. Joshua didn't bother to lower his voice. "I've noticed your suspicious behavior since you walked in." Pretending to. Brows wandering into the rarest sections. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. 68 years of life, decades of honest work, unshakable faith and silent sacrifice, all reduced to a single accusation from a young man who knew nothing about her story, nothing about the words printed in that book he guarded so fiercely without ever truly understanding. "I'm not stealing anything," Eleanor said, her voice now lower but still steady. "I would never do that." She gently tried to free her arm from Joshua's grasp, but he only tightened it further, clearly unwilling to back down. "There's no point in insisting, Grandma. I'm not letting you go back there." Kayla stood in the bedroom doorway, arms crossed, her expression resolute. The Saturday afternoon light filtered through the window, casting a golden glow on the dust particles dancing between them. A week had passed since the incident at the bookstore. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, folding her worn wool coat across her lap, her fingers methodically working on a nearly invisible patch. The small crucifix around her neck swayed gently as she leaned into the mending. "Kayla," she replied without looking up, her voice carrying that ancestral patience. "There are some things a person has to do, even when everyone says it's better to give up." "I know what happened, Grandma." Kayla's voice wavered slightly. "Mrs. Davis saw you there. She told me how that man treated you, how everyone stared, how he—" The girl swallowed hard, unable to finish the sentence. Her grandmother's humiliation was a wound she felt deep in her own skin. Eleanor's knotted fingers paused for a moment, the needle catching a glint of sunlight. The silence between them was thick with untold stories, with old battles Eleanor had never wanted her granddaughter to face. "It wasn't the first time someone judged me without knowing me, sweetheart," she finally said. "And I doubt it'll be the last." Kayla stepped into the room, sitting beside her grandmother on the bed, which creaked gently beneath the added weight. The contrast between them was striking. Youth and wisdom, smooth skin and time-worn hands, impulsiveness and measured resolve. But why go back? To be humiliated again? What's so important about that bookstore? Eleanor set the coat aside and, for the first time, looked her granddaughter straight in the eyes. Her gaze, framed by deep wrinkles, held a determination that belied her fragile appearance. "When your mother passed and you came to live with me, do you remember what I used to tell you every night before bed?" Kayla lowered her eyes, her voice almost a whisper. "That some storms only end when we learn to dance in the rain." "Exactly." Eleanor smiled, brushing Kayla's cheek with gentle fingers. "For 40 years, I ran from that rain. Now, it's time to dance." She stood slowly, slipping on the patched coat. Every movement was deliberate, as if part of a long-rehearsed ritual. From the dresser drawer, she pulled out a small yellowed envelope. The distant sound of honking horns and the steady hum of the city drifted in through the half-open window, reminding them of the world outside, a world that hadn't always been kind to women like them. "Grandma, I don't get it," Kayla pressed, watching as Eleanor tucked the envelope into her battered purse. "What's in that place that's worth all this? It's just an old book." "It's not just a book," Eleanor said, adjusting her vintage glasses. "It's my story, our story." Her voice took on a firmer tone. "Someday you'll understand that there are things we do not for the comfort they bring, but for the truth they restore." Kayla stood up, a new understanding beginning to take shape in her young eyes. "Then, let me come with you this time, please. I don't want you to face that alone again." Eleanor shook her head, adjusting the small bun of graying hair. "Some journeys have to be made alone, sweetheart. But when I come back, I promise I'll tell you everything. Every word." She took the worn Bible from the nightstand and placed it carefully in her purse. "There are some secrets I've kept for far too long." The afternoon light was shifting now, casting longer shadows across the apartment's worn floorboards. Eleanor looked out the window toward the jagged skyline of Manhattan. Somewhere out there in that concrete jungle, a book awaited her. A book that held her words, her heart, her true name, hidden for decades. "What are you going to do when you get there?" Kayla asked, her voice softer now, giving in to the unshakable resolve she saw in her grandmother's eyes. "What if that man calls the police this time?" Eleanor smiled, a calm, serene, almost mysterious smile. "That won't happen. I'm just going to reveal a truth that's been hidden for too long." She adjusted the crucifix at her neck, an unconscious gesture she always made before facing something difficult. "You know, Kayla, sometimes silence protects, but eventually it starts to suffocate too." The sound of the door opening sliced through the bookstore's sophisticated silence like a dissonant note. Eleanor Brooks stepped inside slowly, with the same serenity she used when folding clean linens at home. But something in her eyes made it clear this wasn't just another visit. Her floral dress swayed gently with the cold wind trailing in from the street, and her steady footsteps echoed almost defiantly against the polished wooden floor. Behind the counter, Joshua looked up and recognized her immediately. His face hardened. He straightened himself like a man preparing for a confrontation. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered through clenched teeth. But Eleanor simply walked, unhurried, unafraid. Nearby customers began to turn their heads discreetly. A woman in a beige coat whispered something to her companion. There was a shared discomfort in the air, that subtle kind of social unease. No one admits, but everyone feels. Joshua moved out from behind the counter, his footsteps brisk and almost hostile. "You're not welcome here," he said under his breath, but with sharpness. Eleanor looked at him with the calm of someone who's learned how to survive without making noise. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just need to see one book. Just one." Her words hung between them, suspended like an unanswered prayer. But he didn't budge. "I told you, it's not happening again. I won't allow another scene," Joshua said, trying to reassert control. He gestured wildly, as if putting on a performance for those watching. Eleanor didn't move. "I have something to show you. It's in the book." Her voice carried a subtle weight, like a secret kept far too long. Joshua sighed, visibly impatient, but now intrigued. "And what would that be? A receipt? A story?" Eleanor clutched the crucifix hanging from her neck and answered, her voice low but unwavering. "A truth." Tension spread like a thin fog. Some customers pretended to continue browsing, but their eyes followed every movement, every word. Eleanor slowly made her way toward the rare bookshelf, and Joshua trailed behind her like a poorly trained mall security guard. When she reached out for the burgundy-bound book, the same one that had sparked her humiliation a week earlier, Joshua intercepted with an outstretched palm. "Show me whatever you need to, but over here." He motioned toward a small table at the back of the bookstore. It was the kind of concession offered to someone you want to keep in sight and under control. Seated at the table, Eleanor carefully opened her bag. She took out an old cloth wrapped around a small magnifying lens, the kind used by bookbinders. Then she gently turned the book's spine, as if touching something sacred. Every movement carried a sense of reverence. Joshua stood over her, arms crossed, trying to mask his discomfort. The entire room seemed to be holding its breath. Eleanor opened the book to a specific page and ran her fingers lightly over a faint mark at the bottom of the sheet. It was barely visible, until she pointed to a name, and silence fell over the room like a veil. "Take a closer look," she said. Her voice sounded like an echo from a faraway time, perhaps from when writing. "Hurt more than staying silent." Joshua hesitated. Then reluctantly he picked up the lens. When his eyes finally caught the tiny handwritten dedication, the color drained from his face. The words were simple, but devastating. The signature, subtle, bore the name of the author he had long admired, with one detail he never would have imagined. He stepped back. The bookstore went still, and before anyone could speak, Eleanor closed the book. "Now that you've seen it," she said, "decide what you're going to do with it." Joshua said nothing. He just stood there, frozen, embarrassed, reduced to his own ignorance. The little table suddenly seemed too small to contain the truth that had just been revealed, and the eyes of the others, once full of judgment, now searched for somewhere else to look. Eleanor rose slowly, as if carrying a lifetime on her shoulders, and before she left, she looked once more at the bookshelf. There was no doubt now. The truth had a name, and it was finally ready to be spoken. The book lay closed on the table, yet the weight of its contents seemed to press against every inch of the room. Joshua still held the magnifying lens, as if afraid to touch what he had just discovered. Eleanor remained standing, her posture calm, the kind of calm that comes from having weathered storms far greater than hostile stares. A subtle murmur drifted through the bookstore's aisles, like the wind before a storm. A customer slowly rose from a nearby armchair. Another pretended to adjust his glasses, but never took his eyes off the scene. The tension tasted like old dust and words never spoken. "You wrote this?" Joshua's voice came out as a broken whisper, as if afraid of the answer. Eleanor simply nodded, her fingers resting on the book with near reverence. 40 years ago, she said gently, I used a name no one would recognize, because back then no one wanted to recognize it. Joshua swallowed hard. His eyes returned to the inked dedication. For the one who learned to speak through silence, with eternal love, E.B. The initials finally made sense. The author everyone believed to be lost, dead, or fictional was standing right in front of him. But why? He asked, still confused, still trying to understand what his eyes alone couldn't explain. Eleanor slowly took a seat, with the same care one might use to open a chest full of painful memories. Because no one would have accepted a woman like me back then, let alone a black woman writing about love, loss, and redemption. She gave a small, unbitter smile. So, I let the book speak for me, and I hid behind it. Joshua looked away for a moment. For the first time, he felt the discomfort of someone realizing they'd always known far less than they thought. The atmosphere in the bookstore shifted. It was no longer just curiosity. It was confused reverence, laced with quiet shame. Eleanor opened the book again, flipping through pages marked with small, nearly invisible folds. This is the only copy I ever signed by hand. I never thought it would survive, but it did. She turned the book toward Joshua, and it was here, waiting just like me. Her eyes weren't asking for apologies nor seeking validation. They simply said, I was here all along, even if no one wanted to see me. Joshua pulled up a chair and sat down, now silent. It was as if everything around him had shifted. The bookstore, the books, his very role within it. For the first time, he had no words. I don't want fame, Eleanor said, breaking the silence. I didn't come here for recognition. I just needed to see with my own eyes that my voice, even silenced, still echoed somewhere. She closed the book gently. And now I know it does. But before Joshua could respond, a customer slowly approached and touched Eleanor's shoulder. Are you the author? The question carried a mix of disbelief and restrained admiration. Eleanor simply smiled and glanced at Joshua. He looked back, as if finally understanding the magnitude of the story he had once overlooked. And in that moment, the future of the bookstore, of that story and of his own choices, began to change. The walls of the small Harlem apartment seemed more alive that night. The lamp beside the armchair cast a golden glow over old photographs and stacks of books on crooked shelves. Eleanor sat with the book in her lap, but her eyes no longer read. They wandered through memory, like someone walking down closed corridors where time's dust hides the scars. Her granddaughter, Kayla, slept in the next room. And in the living room, there was only the sound of the ticking clock and the gentle creak of the wood beneath her feet. Her old Bible rested beside the sofa, opened to Psalm 27, just as it always was the night before a hard decision. On the screen of her old laptop, the name she had pretended didn't exist for years was now being searched by dozens of readers. Eleanor Brooks, pseudonym of Elizabeth B., author of The Lily's Shadow, a book about longing, faith, and love, written after she lost her twin sister, Lucille. She closed her eyes for a moment and saw her sister laughing, sitting under a tree in the summer of 1981, reading aloud the first pages of the story. Lucille believed the world needed to hear those words, but the world, back then, wasn't ready to see two black women at the top of literary charts. They asked me to rewrite the ending with a less spiritual tone, Eleanor murmured, as if speaking to her sister's ghost. Said no one would believe that faith could redeem someone. She refused and paid the price. The contract was cancelled, her name removed from the cover, and the published version was printed under a gender-neutral pseudonym, a market strategy, they said. Eleanor never told her daughter, certainly not her granddaughter. She kept the secret like it was a sin. not out of shame, but survival, and the fear that revealing it would make old wounds bleed again. She rose slowly and went to the bookshelf, pulling down a small wooden box. Inside, a handkerchief with the initials LB stitched into the fabric, now yellowed with age. It had belonged to her sister. Beside it, a letter never sent, written in 1985 to an editor who never replied. The words in the letter were steady, yet full of pain. "I don't need you to publish my name. I just want you to know that I exist, and that this story is real, that it was born from a promise between sisters." Eleanor read the line in silence, eyes brimming with tears. The letter ended with a sentence she never forgot. "I write so Lucille can live, even if no one knows it's me." Across the city, in the bookstore, still hushed after the day's events, Joshua was scrolling through digital archives. The light from the screen reflected confusion, guilt, and curiosity on his face. He came across an old interview with the late editor who had published The Lily's Shadow. The man described the author as reclusive, shy, deeply spiritual, and said she preferred to remain anonymous. But in scanned notes, one highlighted sentence caught Joshua's attention. "She had the hands of someone who wrote with tears." He read it again and again, and slowly he began to understand. This woman didn't want applause. She just wanted to be heard. In the quiet hours of the night, Eleanor returned to the armchair. She picked up her Bible, ran her fingers along the worn edge of the pages, and prayed softly, not for recognition but for peace. For the first time in many years, she felt the promise made to her sister was beginning to be fulfilled. And even if the world hadn't been ready before, maybe now it was. But her faith had never waited for applause. It had only endured, steady, like the root of a lily that grows in silence, even in the hardest soil. Rain fell lightly against the fogged-up windows of Harlem that Sunday afternoon. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, calmly folding napkins, as if preparing her spirit for something she wasn't sure she wanted to face. The teapot sat cooling beside. Her and her Bible lay open, but her eyes were fixed on the door. Kayla, standing near the sink, watched her grandmother with the same attentiveness she gave to the characters in her favorite books. "Are you really going to let him in?" she asked softly. Eleanor smiled without answering. Sometimes faith doesn't need to explain itself. It just shows up. The doorbell rang at exactly 3:00 p.m. Eleanor rose slowly and walked to the door. When she opened it, there he was, Joshua Parker, holding an envelope and a small arrangement of simple flowers, wearing the expression of someone who arrived more exposed than prepared. His modern suit contrasted with the look in his eyes, that of a lost boy. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Brooks. I was wondering if I could speak with you for a few minutes." Eleanor didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. She simply opened the door wider and gestured with her hand, inviting him in. A small gesture, but heavy with the unexpected. The room felt smaller with Joshua inside. He looked around, clearly moved by the simplicity and the life woven into every detail. Family portraits, worn books, an embroidered verse on the wall. "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." He sat carefully. "I read everything I could about your book. About the publication, about what happened." Eleanor sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. Joshua cleared his throat, shifted in his seat. "I was wrong. I judged you by your appearance, your clothes, your silence. And later, I was too proud to listen. I don't know how to make it right, but I needed to apologize, truly." There was a long pause. Eleanor took a deep breath. "Silence is where I learned to survive, Mr. Parker. It isn't absence, it's resistance." Joshua looked down, moved. She continued, "I didn't come to your bookstore to be recognized. I just wanted to know if what I wrote was still there, still alive, because not everyone survives being forgotten." She pulled an old photo from her Bible, her and Lucille, sitting on the floor with the manuscript between them. She handed it to him. It was for her and for the promise I made at her coffin. Eleanor's voice trembled, but it didn't break. Joshua held the photo for a few moments. "You wrote with your soul, and I treated your presence like a nuisance." The words were harsh, but he didn't soften them. "If there's anything I can do..." Anything at all. Please tell me. Eleanor stood and walked to the shelf. She picked up the book and returned, placing it on the table between them. Read it again, but this time with the eyes of someone who isn't searching for beauty, but for truth. He nodded silently, and he understood that the gesture was more than an invitation. It was a test, a path, a forgiveness still under construction. As he left, Joshua thanked her, holding the book tightly to his chest. Behind the cracked door, Kayla watched with a tight chest. When he was gone, the girl stepped into the room and sat beside her grandmother. "Grandma, did you really forgive him?" Eleanor looked at the crucifix hanging from her neck. "We don't forgive because the other person deserves it, Kayla. We forgive because our soul needs rest." Outside, the rain began to ease, and the sky, still gray, let a faint beam of light break through, the kind of light that only shows up after pain. The following week, Eleanor's email inbox received a message with a simple subject line: "Proposal for recognition." It took her 2 days to open it, not out of fear of its contents, but because she knew that, once she did, something inside her would shift. When she finally clicked, Joshua's words appeared with unmistakable sincerity. He spoke of the mistake he had made, the impact of the revelation, and a genuine desire to transform the very space, the bookstore that once pushed her away, into a stage for justice. He invited Eleanor to be publicly honored as the true author of the work, an event, a reunion, a name, finally revealed. Eleanor read every word slowly. Then she closed the laptop and sat in silence for a while, resting in her armchair. Her eyes wandered to the open Bible on the table and to the photo of her sister smiling from a wooden frame. "And now, Lucille," she whispered. There was a mixture of relief and fear. The promise was being fulfilled, but with it came old ghosts, the stairs, the judgment, the ancient shame. Kayla entered the room, noticed her grandmother's distant expression, and sat on the floor at her feet. "It's the invitation, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded. Her granddaughter held her hand and said, "You always told me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting even when you're trembling." That night, Eleanor prayed without words, just her fingers tightly gripping the crucifix. Her eyes moved over the old notes scribbled in the Bible's margins, where she had once written, "Even if the world never knows my name, God hears my voice." And there, in the silence of the room, she understood that the promise made to her sister wasn't just about recognition. It was about liberation. Accepting the invitation wasn't about stepping onto a stage. It was about stepping out of the hiding place she had lived in for nearly half a century, and allowing other women like her, invisible, silenced, dismissed, to see that there was still room to bloom, even late. The next morning, she replied to the email with just one sentence. "I accept, but let it be about the story, not the ego." Joshua responded within minutes. He promised to handle everything with care and respect, that the event would be more than a tribute. It would be a reckoning with literature and with truth. As she read his reply, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to shrink herself to fit in, and maybe, just maybe, she could inspire other women to do the same. The voice of those who wait in silence also deserves to be heard, she thought. In the days that followed, Kayla helped her grandmother pick out something to wear. "Nothing new, please," Eleanor said. "I want to go as I've always been because that's how I wrote." They chose a pale blue dress with tiny flowers, the same one she wore the day she took Lucille to a book launch that never happened. Kayla smiled and said, "You're going to shine, Grandma." Eleanor gently arranged her silver curls. "I didn't come to shine, dear. I came to remember." And with that, she tucked her sister's embroidered handkerchief into her pocket, the small crucifix around her neck, and the courage she had carried for decades. On the eve of the event, Joshua called. His voice was different now, more humble, more aware. "You're going to change more lives than you realize, Mrs. Eleanor." She thanked him with calm grace. Then she hung up and stood at the window, where the city lights flickered like the pages of a book yet to be written. Tomorrow her story would be told, not as fiction, but as truth. And even though anxiety still weighed on her chest, Eleanor knew some stories need decades before they're finally heard, but once they find their place, no one can silence them again. The facade of the Golden Page bookstore had never looked so radiant. For the first time, its stained glass windows reflected more than status. They reflected hope. A small sign in the display window featured a black and white photo of the first edition of The Lily's Shadow, beside a line in delicate script. Authorship confirmed, Eleanor Brooks. Inside, the space brimmed with anticipation. Shelves adorned with white flowers, chairs arranged around a modest stage, lighting softer than usual. And at the center of it all, the book, that same one with the handwritten dedication, lay open as if finally able to breathe. Eleanor entered with Kayla by her side, her steps steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. She wore the light blue floral dress, the wool coat, and the small crucifix around her neck. The crowd parted respectfully. Many didn't know her, but all understood what she represented now. Joshua stood near the microphone. He was dressed simply, hands trembling. When he saw Eleanor approaching, he gave a slight bow of the head. A small gesture, but a symbolic one. The man who once cast her out now acknowledged her presence as essential. It was time to begin, and this time, with the right name. Joshua took the mic. His voice was different now, no longer the voice of a man who judged by appearance. Ladies and gentlemen, today is not just a literary celebration. It's her day of justice. He paused, visibly moved. 40 years ago, a story was born, a story written with pain, faith, and courage. But the name behind it was silenced. Today, that name is revealed. With pride, I present the true author of The Lily's Shadow, Eleanor Brooks. The bookstore fell into 2 long, suspended seconds of silence. Then the applause began. Hesitant at first, then swelling like waves. It was as if time itself had finally made peace with the truth. Eleanor stepped up to the microphone. She took a deep breath. Kayla stood beside the stage, holding her hand like an invisible anchor. I never expected to be here. In fact, I spent most of my life running from this. Her voice was calm but rich with meaning. I wrote this book at a time when women like me weren't allowed to sign what we felt. And even so, I wrote it because some promises can't be broken. She pulled from her pocket the handkerchief with her sister's initials and held it up for all to see. Lucille. She believed our words could heal. And even after she was gone, I kept writing. In the dark. In silence. The audience's eyes were filled with tears. Eleanor continued. I didn't come seeking fame, I came to keep a promise, and maybe to inspire other women who've been silenced to remember that their stories still matter. She looked at Kayla, then at Joshua, and finally at the audience. This moment isn't just mine. It belongs to my sister, to my granddaughter, and to every woman who's carried her faith, even when the world offered no space. Another deep silence spread, not the silence of indifference, but of reverence. As Eleanor stepped down from the stage, she was met with hugs, handshakes, and heartfelt tears. Joshua walked her over to the signing table. May I ask for one? He said, holding a copy in his trembling hands. Eleanor smiled. This time, with my real name. She signed slowly, then added a new dedication. For those who learned to listen in silence, with courage and compassion, Eleanor Brooks. When she handed the book back, Joshua held it carefully, as if receiving something sacred. And for the first time, she saw a man transformed, not perfect, but on the path. At the end of the night, just outside, Eleanor looked once more at the bookstore's glowing facade. Kayla snapped a photo of her grandmother standing in front. Of the window, the poster and book reflected behind her. This one's going in the frame at home, she said with a grin. Eleanor nodded. The cold had begun to settle on her shoulders, but something inside her felt warm. The story had finally been told, not with shouting, not with fury, but with courage, with presence. with the quiet kind of faith that, even when ignored for decades, never stopped blooming. Eleanor didn't return to the bookstore seeking justice. She returned because a part of her had never been laid to rest. The book wasn't just an object, it was a bridge between pain and redemption. Every line written within it carried an absence, every word a sister lost too soon, and every silence held for 40 years was an unanswered prayer. She didn't want fame, she only wanted to keep a promise and free what fear had silenced. Joshua changed too, not because someone forced him, but because something inside him finally broke open. For the first time, he saw beyond covers of books and of people, and he realized there was a whole author behind the woman he had judged by her coat. Sometimes all someone needs is to be heard without being interrupted, to be seen without being measured, to be remembered without having to shout. Eleanor taught that without raising her voice, simply by being. Kayla never forgot that day. Not the speech, not her great-aunt's handkerchief, now kept on her shelf, not the way her grandmother clutched the crucifix before stepping on stage. She learned then that courage doesn't come from noise, but from endurance. That faith isn't just praying, it's returning, even when wounded. And that real stories don't need embellishment, they just need to be told with truth, because truth always finds a way to bloom. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because maybe there's an Eleanor in all of our lives, waiting for the right moment to be remembered, to be embraced, and finally, to be called by her real name.